Welcome back to Room 57, where we dive deep into the most shocking, complex, and disturbing criminal cases from around the world. Today, we delve into a case that has haunted the UK and made waves internationally, a case that raised crucial questions about childhood, justice, and the nature of evil. This is the tragic and harrowing story of James Bulger, a 2-year-old boy whose life was stolen away in the most unimaginable way. The year was 1993, and little James Bulger had no idea that a seemingly ordinary day at the New Strand shopping center in Bootle, England, would be his last. On February 12, 1993, James was out shopping with his mother, Denise, when, in the blink of an eye, he was abducted by 2 young boys. These 2 children, just 10 years old, would lead James away from the safety of his mother, torturing and ultimately murdering him in the most brutal of ways. But what made this case even more disturbing wasn't just the cold, calculating nature of the crime. It was the fact that the perpetrators, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables, were children themselves, the boys no older than James Bulger, who were capable of such heartless violence. How could 2 children, so young, commit such a heinous crime? And how did they come to commit such an act of evil? In this episode, we will dive into the chilling details of the James Bulger case, the abduction, the murder, the investigation, and the trial that followed. We will explore the complicated motivations behind this tragedy, the responses from the public and the media, and the legal and moral debates it sparked. What does this case reveal about the potential for violence in young minds, the role of the justice system in dealing with child offenders, and the questions that remain unanswered decades later? This is a story of innocence lost, betrayal, and the terrifying reality of human nature. But this case is also about the lasting impact it has had on the world. It's a story that raised debates about how we, as a society, handle children who commit murder. Should they be treated as adults, or should they be given a second chance at rehabilitation? It's a case that tested the limits of our understanding of childhood innocence and the capacity for evil. It's a story that, even years later, continues to stir emotions and prompt deep questions about the criminal justice system and our society's moral compass. As we take a deep dive into this case, we'll examine the shocking details of the crime, the complex psychological profiles of the young offenders, and the aftermath that continues to haunt not only the Bulger family, but the world at large. We'll explore how this tragedy changed laws, redefined the discussion on juvenile justice, and forced people to confront difficult questions about childhood violence. Let's start by going back to that tragic day, February 12, 1993, and retracing the events that led to the brutal and heartbreaking murder of James Bulger. The abduction, a seemingly innocent day, turns dark in that fateful day. Denise Fergus, James's mother, was shopping with her son at the New Strand shopping center in Bootle. James, a happy and innocent 2-year-old, was playing with a balloon as his mother browsed the aisles. Denise briefly turned away, likely to look at an item on a shelf. In those few seconds, her life and the life of her son would change forever. Robert, Thompson and Jon Venables, the 10-year-olds who were at the shopping center that day, saw James alone and unguarded. The boys, who had spent the day together causing minor trouble, suddenly had a plan. They approached James and lured him away from the shopping center. James, a child too young to understand danger, trusted them and willingly followed them out of the mall. Denise, unaware that her son was missing, continued shopping. It wasn't until she went to check on James that she realized he was gone. Panic immediately set in, and she alerted the mall security team. By then, it was too late. James had already been taken. Robert and Jon led James for over 2 miles, away from the shopping center, to a remote area near a railway track. Along the way, they subjected him to unspeakable violence, torturing and tormenting him in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend. By the time the police started their search, James was already beyond help. The boys, cold and emotionless, left behind a trail of destruction that would not only devastate a family, but shock an entire nation. The crime, a brutal murder beyond imagination. Full extent of the crime was soon revealed when James's body was found in a railway yard 2 days later. On February 14, 1993, his injuries were horrific: blunt force trauma to the head, extensive bruising, and signs of physical abuse. James had been murdered in cold blood, his life snuffed out by 2 children who, by law, were still children themselves. But what was perhaps even more disturbing than the murder itself was the complete lack of remorse shown by the 2 perpetrators. Robert and John didn't seem to grasp the gravity of their actions. In fact, during their interrogations, they appeared almost nonchalant about the crime. It was as if they were unable to comprehend the suffering they had caused. This disturbing lack of empathy left both the police and the public in disbelief. How could two children, so young, be capable of such violence? What could possibly drive them to commit such a heinous act? These questions would haunt the investigation, the trial, and the years that followed. The investigation. How could this happen? As the investigation into James Bulger's death unfolded, the authorities began to piece together the events that led up to the murder. CCTV footage from the shopping center provided the first crucial lead. The footage showed Robert and John leading James away, hand in hand. It was chilling to see how easily the two boys had led James away, without anyone noticing, without anyone suspecting that these children were capable of what was about to unfold. In the weeks following James's death, the case became a media sensation. The idea that children could be involved in such a gruesome crime baffled the public. As the investigation progressed, Robert and John were arrested and questioned. Their confessions were chilling. The two boys admitted to abducting James, but their reasons for doing so were disturbingly vague. They did not explain why they chose James or what exactly drove them to kill him. Their confessions revealed a mix of defiance, guilt, and confusion, but it was clear that they had acted in cold blood. The legal system was now forced to reckon with the difficult question: what should happen to 10-year-olds who had committed such a heinous crime? The trial, a nation in shock. The trial of Robert Thompson and Jon Venables began in November 1993, and it was unlike any other in British legal history. The idea of holding children responsible for murder was almost unprecedented, and the case raised deep moral, legal, and psychological questions. The public was divided. Some believed that the boys were too young to fully understand the consequences of their actions and that they should be treated differently from adult criminals. Others argued that no child should be able to commit such an act without facing the full consequences. In the end, the court decided that the boys were guilty of murder, but their sentences were controversial. Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were sentenced to detention until they reached the age of 18. The decision to imprison them for a fixed term instead of life imprisonment was based on their age, but it sparked a national debate on whether juvenile offenders should be tried as adults for such heinous crimes. Conclusion: the aftermath, a case that changed everything. The murder of James Bulger remains one of the most haunting and disturbing cases in criminal history, but it is also a case that forced society to reckon with uncomfortable truths about childhood, morality, and justice. The legacy of James's death raised difficult questions about how we, as a society, deal with young offenders, how we define innocence, and how we can protect vulnerable children from the horrors of violence. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the lasting impact of James Bulger's tragic death and the aftermath that shaped not only the justice system, but the way we think about child killers and rehabilitation. Part 1. The shocking abduction. A day like any other turns into a nightmare. James Bulger was just 2 years old when his life was tragically cut short. He was a vibrant and innocent child with a promising future, but on the day he was abducted, everything changed in an instant. February 12, 1993 was supposed to be an ordinary day. James had spent the morning with his mother, Denise Fergus, at the New Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, England. The two were simply going about their day when James was stolen from his mother, and his life was forever altered. What followed was a chain of events so horrifying it would send shock waves across the nation and beyond. The moment of abduction, the start of a terrifying chain of events. It all started when Denise and James were in the shopping center, a bustling place that day with its usual shoppers and families. Denise, who was in her early 20s, had been enjoying a quiet afternoon out with her son. James, a curious and lively child, had been playing with a balloon that day. He was simply a toddler, unaware of the dangers lurking around him. Denise was focused on her shopping, checking out a few items when, for a brief moment, she turned away. In those few seconds, James was snatched from her sight, disappearing from the bustling crowd. His abduction was swift and unexpected. Denise, realizing James was no longer by her side, began searching frantically. She checked the nearby aisles and called out for him, but he was nowhere to be found. The search continued as Denise began to panic. She ran up and down the aisles, desperately asking other shoppers if they had seen her son. Time seemed to slow down as the seconds turned to minutes, and those minutes soon stretched into what felt like an eternity. As she stood there, helpless, it became clear that something terrible had happened. Security at the shopping center was alerted, and the search expanded to include mall staff and bystanders. Yet, despite the growing fear, James's whereabouts remained a mystery. Denise's heart sank. With every minute that passed, her fear turned to terror. What could have happened to her son? Unbeknownst to Denise, the young boys, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables, had seen James alone. They were 10-year-old children themselves, but they had already been exposed to the darker side of life. Thompson and Venables had spent the day together, causing trouble and mischief at the mall. At some point, they noticed James playing by himself. It wasn't long before the two boys decided to act. The predators, two children on a dark path. Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were from difficult backgrounds. They had both experienced trouble at home and struggled in school. Thompson, in particular, had a history of violent behavior, and both boys were known to be troubled. Thompson's family had a history of instability, with an abusive father and a mother who was often overwhelmed by the challenges of raising him. Venables also came from a broken home, and both boys were often left to their own devices. The mall, a place where children were supposed to feel safe, was merely an opportunity for them to act out. The two boys saw James as an easy target, a vulnerable toddler playing alone. Without a moment's hesitation, they approached James and struck up a conversation. They coaxed him into following them. What seemed like a harmless interaction to James quickly spiraled into a nightmare. They told him they were going to take him on a little walk, and James, trusting and innocent, followed along. The boys led James through the mall, away from the safety of his mother's watchful eye. At no point did anyone suspect what was happening. The innocence of childhood would soon be shattered in the most brutal way. Robert and Jon led James out of the shopping center, into a world they knew all too well, a world full of trouble and violence. As they walked further away from the mall, the gravity of the situation began to unfold. What began as an innocent day at the shops would soon turn into one of the most horrifying crimes in British history. The distance grows. A walk in the darkness, the boys led James away from the public area, into the streets of Bootle. As they walked, they moved further and further away from the eyes of the public, slipping into areas where few would notice them. It was in these desolate streets that the true horror of their intentions began to unfold. The route they chose took them to a railway line. This area, isolated and quiet, offered the perfect location for what was about to happen. It wasn't just a place where the boys could hide from onlookers. It was a place that allowed them to commit their crime without being disturbed. James was innocent. He didn't understand what was happening. He trusted these boys, two children just like him, and followed them willingly. At this point, there was still a chance for someone to intervene, but that chance was rapidly slipping away. James was taken further from safety, and with each step, he was drawn deeper into the terrifying plans of Robert and Jon. As they reached the railway line, the boys began their horrific assault on James. It is difficult to fathom the extent of the brutality that followed, but what is known is chilling. James was subjected to unspeakable violence that no child, let alone a toddler, should ever experience. The attackers used blunt objects, including bricks, to beat James, inflicting horrific injuries. They abused him in ways that were not only violent, but disturbingly calculated. The violence they inflicted was not out of rage, but instead seemed to be carried out with a cold detachment, as if the boys had planned the act from the start. The two boys seemed to have no remorse, no empathy for the innocent child they were torturing. The tragic end, a life cut short. At some point during the attack, James was rendered unconscious. Though he was still alive, his attackers, still acting with the same lack of remorse, took him to a nearby railway track. It was here that the final, brutal part of their crime occurred. James was placed on the tracks and left for dead. The train that passed soon after hit his body, further adding to the horror. When James's body was discovered 2 days later, the extent of the violence was evident. The pathologist's report revealed that James had been severely beaten, suffering extensive injuries before his life was violently taken from him. The brutality of the crime was beyond belief, yet it came from two children, no older than James himself. The shock and devastation were felt not just by the Bulger family, but by an entire nation. How could such a thing happen? How could two young children be capable of such cruelty? These were questions that would plague the investigation, the trial, and the years that followed. The investigation, uncovering the truth as the search for James Bulger continued. The investigation led to a shocking discovery. CCTV footage from the shopping center, which had captured the moment James was taken by the two boys, provided crucial evidence. The footage showed Robert and John walking with James hand in hand, and then leaving the mall together. This footage was critical in solving the case. It revealed the horrifying reality that the young children were responsible for the crime. But even as investigators pieced together the facts, there were still so many unanswered questions about what had driven them to commit such an atrocious act. The investigation into the murder began with a massive search for James, and within days, the entire nation was gripped by the tragedy. When Robert and John were arrested, they initially denied involvement in the crime, but as the evidence mounted, their confessions slowly began to reveal the horror of what had happened. Robert and John's motives remained unclear. There seemed to be no clear reason for their actions. They were young, but their behavior suggested a level of cruelty far beyond their years. The aftermath of the crime would forever change the way the UK and the world viewed juvenile offenders. The case raised troubling questions about the capacity for violence in children, and whether the justice system was equipped to handle such young offenders in a fair and just manner. Could children as young as 10 truly understand the consequences of their actions, or were they simply too young to be held fully accountable? Conclusion of Part 1. Innocence lost. Questions unanswered. James Bulger's abduction and murder remain one of the most chilling cases in recent history. It raised questions not only about the capacity for violence in young minds, but also about the moral and legal implications of prosecuting children for such brutal acts. In the next part of this series, we will explore the trial that followed, the shocking revelations that came to light, and the difficult questions about justice that the case prompted. Stay tuned as we continue to delve into this complex and heartbreaking case, the story of a young boy's tragic death, and the two children who changed everything in an instant. Part 2. The investigation, uncovering the truth behind the criminal disappearance and subsequent brutal murder of James Bulger shook the nation, but the true horror of the crime did not become fully apparent until the investigation began to unfold. What was initially perceived as an abduction by a stranger soon took a shocking turn when it was revealed that the perpetrators were not adult criminals, but two young boys, just 10 years old. The investigation into the murder was both a search for answers and a process of grappling with the implications of juvenile violence. How could children so young be capable of such brutality? What drove Robert Thompson and Jon Venables to commit such an unimaginable crime? The search for James Bulger. As the initial hours of the search for James Bulger unfolded, his mother, Denise Fergus, and the police were faced with the grim reality that the child may not have simply wandered off. James had been missing since the moment Denise lost sight of him in the shopping center, and while police initially believed he could have been lost or wandering nearby, the growing suspicion of foul play started to set in. On February 14, 1993, 2 days after the abduction, the unthinkable happened. James's body was discovered on a railway track in Walton, near a busy junction. His body had been brutally battered, and it was clear that he had been subjected to a horrifying ordeal before his death. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, consistent with the injuries caused by the repeated beatings James had endured. However, the details of how his body ended up on the train tracks would take much longer to uncover. As the investigation into the crime gathered momentum, the police began to consider all possible angles. It was not uncommon for children to be abducted by strangers, but this case quickly took on a new and disturbing dimension. The police turned their attention to the mall footage, hoping that the CCTV cameras might hold the key to what had happened to James. The CCTV footage, the breakthrough in the case, came when investigators reviewed the CCTV footage from the New Strand shopping center. The cameras, which had been running continuously, had captured the moments when James was taken by the two boys. In the footage, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were clearly visible walking with James. At first glance, it seemed like a harmless interaction between children, but the context became undeniable as investigators zoomed in on the footage. The CCTV footage showed Robert and John leading James through the mall. James, who was 2 years old, appeared to follow the boys without resistance, seemingly trusting them as if they were merely older friends. At one point, the footage showed the boys leading James away from the safety of the shopping center and heading out toward the quieter streets. There was no indication that James knew he was in danger or that anything was wrong. To him, these boys were simply the older children, and he trusted them as he had been taught to trust others. As the footage revealed, the boys didn't appear to be hurried, nor did they seem panicked. It was as though they were confident that no one would stop them, and no one did. The CCTV footage depicted them walking out of the shopping center with James, leading him away from the public and into an area where the security cameras lost sight of them. This moment of capture would become a key piece of evidence, confirming that James had been abducted and showing that the perpetrators were indeed children themselves. The growing suspicion Robert Thompson and Jon Venables with. The CCTV footage in hand, the investigation shifted its focus to Robert Thompson and Jon Venables. The two boys were immediately questioned by the police. Initially, both denied any involvement in the crime. However, investigators soon began to uncover disturbing details about their backgrounds, which hinted at a darker side to their personalities. Robert Thompson, who was 10 years old at the time, had already shown signs of violent tendencies. He came from a troubled family where there was a history of neglect and abuse. His father had a criminal history, and his mother was reportedly overwhelmed by the challenges of raising him. At school, Robert had been known for his erratic behavior, often lashing out and showing a lack of empathy toward other children. He was known to get into fights and was frequently reprimanded for his behavior. Despite his age, he had already been exposed to violence and anger. Jon Venables, the other perpetrator, came from a similarly troubled background. He also had a history of disruptive behavior in school and had been exposed to violence in his home life. Jon's family life was marked by instability, and like Robert, he had shown little regard for authority or the welfare of others. Both boys had been growing up in environments that were far from ideal, with little guidance or supervision. However, it was not just their troubled backgrounds that raised suspicions. It was the fact that both boys had been involved in a violent act that was, at the time, almost unimaginable. The idea that two children so young could be responsible for the brutal murder of another child seemed inconceivable to many. The interrogation, confessions, and unraveling the truth. As the investigation deepened, the police began to question the two boys more intensely. Their initial denials soon gave way to cracks in their stories. Under the pressure of questioning, both Robert and Jon began to change their accounts of the events, slowly revealing more details of their involvement. Jon Venables was the first to break. He confessed that he had been involved in taking James, and as his confession began to unfold, it became clear that Robert Thompson had played an active role as well. Jon revealed how the two boys had lured James away from the shopping center, coaxing him to follow them with the promise of playing together. He described how they led him out of the mall and across busy roads, and how they had taken him to the nearby railway tracks. The details of what happened next were harrowing. Jon admitted that they had brutally assaulted James, using bricks and other blunt objects to beat him. He claimed that James had tried to cry out and escape, but the boys were relentless. They did not seem to care for the suffering they were causing. The violence they inflicted was cold and calculated, as if they were acting out a twisted desire for power and control over the helpless toddler. The interrogation revealed a chilling sense of detachment in both Robert and Jon. There was no remorse in their statements, only a lack of understanding of the gravity of their actions. They spoke about the murder as though it were just another event, something they had done without truly understanding what they had done. Both boys continued to show a disturbing level of indifference as they described the horror they had inflicted on James Bulger. The motive: why would children commit such a horrible crime? One of the most pressing questions in the aftermath of the crime was, why? Why would the young boys commit such a brutal act? Could they have understood the consequences of their actions? And what, if anything, could have motivated them to kill a child so much younger than themselves? The question of motive remained unclear for much of the investigation. Was it simply the result of violent tendencies? Was it something deeper, like a desire to prove themselves or gain control over another person? Many experts suggested that the boys had acted out of a need for power and dominance, but no concrete reason could be found. Robert and Jon were not driven by a personal vendetta against James. Instead, their actions seemed to stem from a twisted desire to prove themselves, or perhaps to experience violence in a way they had seen before, but had not fully understood. Some experts believe that the boys' violent actions might have been influenced by their exposure to violence in their homes, and communities. They had been raised in environments where violence was normalized, and it was possible that they had internalized these behaviors without understanding the devastating impact they would have on their victim. The tragic death of James Bulger raised uncomfortable questions about childhood violence, the role of upbringing, and whether children could be held accountable for crimes that, in many ways, seemed beyond their understanding. The legal system would now have to grapple with how to deal with two 10-year-olds who had committed such a brutal act. Could they be tried as adults? Should they be punished as children? The legal debate would soon become just as contentious as the crime itself. Conclusion of Part 2. As the investigation into the murder of James Bulger continued, it became clear that the crime was more than just a simple case of child abduction. The involvement of two 10-year-old boys in such a heinous act was unprecedented, and it would go on to spark debates about juvenile justice, childhood violence, and the responsibilities of parents and communities in preventing such tragedies. The shocking details of the investigation into Robert Thompson and Jon Venables painted a disturbing picture of what happens when children are exposed to violence and neglect. But as the case moved forward, there were still many unanswered questions. The trial would soon begin, and the public would watch as the judicial system grappled with how to deal with two children responsible for the brutal murder of a toddler. In Part 3, we will examine the trial of Robert and Jon, the legal implications of their actions, and the national debate that ensued as the case unfolded. How would society and the justice system respond to 10-year-old boys who had committed such an unimaginable crime? Stay tuned as we continue to follow this tragic story to its conclusion. Part 3, the trial and aftermath, justice, accountability, and the debate over juvenile criminal discovery of James Bulger's brutal murder, and the subsequent investigation painted a chilling picture of a crime committed by two young boys, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables. As the investigation revealed the shocking details of their involvement, the next stage in this tragic case would be the trial. The legal proceedings that followed would spark a national and global debate about juvenile crime, accountability, and the appropriate punishment for children involved in violent acts. The trial of Robert and Jon would not only focus on their actions, but would challenge the very notion of what constitutes justice for children who commit heinous crimes. The charges and the legal system's response to child criminals. On February 20, 1993, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were charged with the murder of James Bulger. They were both only 10 years old at the time of the crime, making them the youngest individuals ever to be charged with murder in Britain in the 20th century. The legal proceedings that followed would be groundbreaking, and the entire country watched as the case unfolded. The first challenge faced by the legal system was whether the boys could be tried as adults or if they should be treated as children. In the United Kingdom, children under the age of 10 were not typically considered criminally responsible, as they were deemed incapable of committing a crime. However, the severity of the crime committed by Robert and Jon meant that the legal system was forced to address a difficult question. Should these boys, who had shown such a complete lack of remorse, be treated as children under the law or as adult criminals? The decision was made to try Robert and Jon in an adult court, which caused further controversy. Under British law, children aged 10 or older could be charged with murder and could face life imprisonment. If found guilty, the case would be tried in the Crown Court, and the boys would be given the chance to present a defense in front of a jury. However, the question of whether a child could truly comprehend the consequences of their actions would be central to the trial. The prosecution's case. The cold-blooded nature of the criminal prosecution presented a powerful case, detailing the horror that James Bulger had endured at the hands of Robert Thompson and Jon Venables. The details of the murder were difficult to stomach, but the prosecution argued that it was clear from the evidence that the two boys had acted with intent and premeditation. The case rested heavily on the CCTV footage showing Robert and Jon leading James out of the shopping center and their subsequent actions as they took him to the nearby railway tracks. The prosecution emphasized the cold, calculated nature of the crime, pointing out that the boys had not only physically assaulted James, but had done so with the intention of causing him harm. They had dragged him along busy streets, past multiple shops, and through areas where they could have been seen by adults, showing a complete disregard for the safety of their victim. The use of bricks, stones, and a metal bar to batter James was another key aspect of the prosecution's case. The prosecution described how James's injuries were consistent with the type of brutality one might expect from adult criminals rather than children. The boys had gone to great lengths to conceal their actions, and they were able to commit the murder without interference from any adults. They showed no remorse afterward and continued to lie to police and deny their involvement. Even after they were confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the prosecution's argument was clear. Robert and John had committed a premeditated murder, and despite their young age, they should be held accountable for their actions. The challenge for the prosecution, however, was proving that they had the mental capacity to understand the gravity of what they had done. Could the 10-year-old boys truly comprehend the consequences of their actions, or were they too young to be held fully responsible for the murder? The defense: can juvenile offenders be held accountable? The defense, on the other hand, took a different approach. Their primary argument was that Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were both too young to fully understand the consequences of their actions. The defense highlighted the boys' troubled backgrounds and pointed to the neglect they had both experienced in their homes. Both Robert and John came from homes marked by instability, neglect, and exposure to violence. Robert had been raised in a household where his father had a history of criminal activity, and his mother struggled to care for him and his siblings. Similarly, John's home life had been chaotic, with reports of neglect and emotional abuse. The defense suggested that these boys had been victims of their environments and that their violent behavior was a result of the trauma they had experienced. They argued that the boys had not acted with premeditation, but had instead been driven by a sense of anger and confusion, stemming from their own personal struggles. According to the defense, Robert and John's actions were not the result of a cold-blooded desire to kill, but were a tragic result of their emotional and psychological immaturity. In the case of Jon Venables, his defense team suggested that he had been heavily influenced by Robert Thompson, who was more dominant and assertive in their relationship. They argued that John had been led into committing the crime by his friend, and that he was not fully aware of the consequences of his actions. It was also suggested that John had a lower level of maturity than his peers, and that this contributed to his inability to understand the seriousness of the situation. The defense team also argued that the boys had shown remorse for their actions, citing their tearful confessions during the investigation. They emphasized that Robert and John had both cooperated with the police and had admitted to their involvement in the murder, suggesting that they understood the gravity of the situation and had begun to feel the weight of their actions. However, many questioned the sincerity of their remorse, especially given the lack of emotional response during the murder and the details of their behavior afterward. Both boys had continued to deny the full extent of their actions, and their confessions were seen by many as a result of police pressure rather than genuine remorse. Despite this, the defense team pressed on with their argument that the boys' young age and troubled background should be taken into consideration when determining their punishment. The trial and the public outcry trial of Robert Thompson and Jon Venables quickly became a media sensation. The public was horrified by the details of the crime, but many were also disturbed by the fact that two young children had committed such a brutal murder. The media coverage was intense, with a constant stream of headlines speculating about the motives behind the crime and the future of the two boys. The case sparked a fierce national debate. Some argued that the boys should be treated as children and given the opportunity for rehabilitation, while others felt that they should face the full consequences of their actions. The debate about whether children as young as 10 could truly be held responsible for such a heinous crime was at the center of public discourse. Many were horrified by the idea of young children being capable of such violence, while others pointed out that the boys had acted with a level of maturity and planning that suggested they were fully aware of what they were doing. The case raised important questions about the capacity of children to commit crimes, the role of parenting and upbringing in shaping behavior, and the limits of juvenile justice. The verdict, a national dividend in November 24, 1993, after a trial that lasted several weeks. Robert Thompson and Jon Venables were found guilty of the murder of James Bulger. They were both sentenced to serve a minimum of 8 years in prison, although they were not given a fixed term and could be released if deemed rehabilitated. The verdict was met with shock and disbelief by many in the public. The idea that two 10-year-old boys could be sentenced to such a long prison term was controversial, and the question of whether they would ever be able to return to society remained a deeply divisive issue. The sentence sparked a national debate about juvenile justice. While some felt that the boys' sentences were justified, given the brutality of the crime. Others felt that their youth and potential for rehabilitation should have been taken into account. In the aftermath of the trial, the Bulger family expressed their deep sorrow and frustration, as they felt that James's death had been overshadowed by the legal complexities surrounding the boy's punishment, the aftermath, rehabilitation, release, and ongoing controversy in the years following their conviction. Robert Thompson and Jon Venables would go on to serve their time in secure facilities. Both boys were subject to intensive rehabilitation programs designed to address the psychological and emotional issues that had contributed to their crime. During their time in prison, they underwent therapy and were monitored for signs of emotional growth and remorse. In 2001, after serving 8 years of their sentence, both Robert and Jon were released on parole. The decision to release them was controversial, as many believed that they had not served enough time for the heinous crime they had committed. However, the parole board determined that both boys had shown signs of rehabilitation and were no longer considered a danger to society. They were given new identities to protect them from public outrage, as the media and the public had continued to be divided over their release. The release of Robert Thompson and Jon Venables remains one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Many believe that the boys should have served longer sentences for their crime, while others feel that they deserved a chance at rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Despite their release, both individuals have faced ongoing challenges. Jon Venables, in particular, has been arrested again for unrelated offenses, leading many to question whether his original sentence and rehabilitation efforts were truly effective. Conclusion of Part 3: The Trial and Aftermath of Robert Thompson and Jon Venables' involvement in the murder of James Bulger became one of the most divisive and controversial legal cases in British history. The debate over juvenile justice, the capacity of children to commit such horrific crimes, and the issue of punishment versus rehabilitation continue to echo in legal circles to this day. As we continue to examine the legacy of this case, it serves as a grim reminder of the complexity of juvenile crime and the need for a careful balance between holding young offenders accountable and offering them a path to rehabilitation. The case of James Bulger remains one of the darkest chapters in Britain's criminal history, a tragedy that continues to prompt reflection on justice, childhood violence, and the boundaries of accountability. Stay tuned for the final part of this series, where we will explore the broader implications of the case and its lasting impact on British law, juvenile justice, and the way we view childhood violence in the modern world. The case of James Bulger remains one of the most heartbreaking and controversial criminal cases in history. As we've explored the shocking details of the crime, the trial, and the aftermath, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Robert Thompson and Jon Venables should have been tried as adults? Or was the decision to treat them as juveniles the right one? How do you feel about their release after serving only a portion of their sentence? Do you think rehabilitation is possible for children who commit such heinous crimes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case thought-provoking and want to dive deeper into more true crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Room 57 for more in-depth discussions on some of the most chilling and complex criminal cases from around the world. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our latest videos. We want to keep the conversation going, so join us in exploring the darker side of justice and the world we live in. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, stay informed and keep questioning the world around you.